I'm Suzanne Guyette, and this is Weekday. On today's show, you're going to meet a Stanford teacher who was fired for refusing to obey the university's drug and alcohol policy, and you'll meet a Stanford administrator who helped to write that policy. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Weekday. I'm Suzanne Guyette. Last month, Stuart Regis, a popular computer science instructor at Stanford University, was fired because he refused to obey the university's drug and alcohol policy. He said he thought that policy violated important First Amendment principles. Stuart is with us today, along with Doug Dupin, who is a Stanford administrator who helped to write that policy, and we're very happy to welcome both of them to Weekday. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Doug, first of all, if you could explain to us briefly exactly what the drug and alcohol policy was at Stanford, is at Stanford, and when it was put into effect.
The current policy at Stanford was put into effect about 6 months ago, and what it says is that if an employee of the university violates the law, any laws concerning controlled substances or alcohol, that the university considers that a violation of its own rules and will apply progressive discipline to such violations.
All right. Now, Stuart, why did you object to this?
Well, I think the question is who's going to enforce those laws. That's the important question. Prior to October 1st, Stanford had a policy that I think was the appropriate policy for a university, and that is to stay out of the enforcement arena. Basically, Stanford decided that they would respect people's privacy unless they behaved irresponsibly, and so they would wait until there was some kind of conviction in court or some kind of serious problem of behavior. I believe that at Stanford, we really do get much more responsible behavior from our students because we treat them as adults, because we don't try to police their behavior. And I think that's an important thing. And so that's why I objected to the policy.
All right. Doug, there was a federal law passed which influenced Stanford's decision to do this, to change its drug policy, to make this drug policy stronger. Tell us about that.
There were two. In 1988, the United States passed the Drug-Free Workplace Act, which required all employers who receive federal funds one way or another to adopt a policy that should an employee violate the law concerning controlled substances, that employee must be subject to discipline by the employer. A second act was passed. It was the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act of 1989, which amended the first act to include alcohol along with controlled substances. So that a year later we had to amend our policy, which was just about controlled substances, to include alcohol.
All right. Now, Stuart, you chose a very vocal way of opposing this policy. You wrote several articles in the Stanford Daily, and you also wrote a letter to Bob Martinez, who is the head of the federal drug program. People affectionately call him the drug czar. Why did you decide to be vocal about it? Why couldn't you have just sort of protested to your students or in private rather than to go so public?
Well, partly because I don't think the problem was at Stanford. I think that a lot of people at Stanford understand why we liked our previous policy, why we like the fact that treating students as adults is a good thing. So I think the problem was at the federal level, the federal government trying to force us to take on an enforcement role. And so that seemed like the appropriate place to try to raise the issue. And my writing of articles and writing of letters was a way of testing this. Because an interesting thing is that you can't be found guilty in court for talking about violating a policy. So this was a way of testing it for me. I've done a lot of talking, and I have been punished. Not in court, though, by Stanford University.
Let's talk about some of the things that you said in the daily articles, because I think this is what sort of inflamed the situation. You said that you carry drugs in your backpack on campus. You told students that they should violate this policy in whatever way that they felt was appropriate. Again, these were things that if you had done it more quietly, you probably would have gotten away with it without any problem.
Well, what I said to the students in terms of the advice, I mean, I made a parallel with things like Virginia's anti-sodomy law. I mean, basically, I said I think this is an unjust policy and people should ignore it. People should behave however they would have behaved in the absence of the policy. As for myself, though, I considered this an invasion of privacy, you know, the university trying to decide what will or won't be in my backpack. And so I kind of chose that as my symbol of the privacy concern, because it's pretty obvious that it's not really a problem for anyone else at the university if I'm carrying drugs in my backpack.
Okay.
And so it was an interesting question.
You also, this wasn't necessarily one of the things that you raised in some of the articles, but this came up later, that you also actually discussed with a student the possibility of taking a hallucinogenic drug and recommended to him that this would probably be a good thing for him. Will you tell us about that?
There was a student who had read my article, and in my article I had mentioned the drug MDA. I'd wanted to make a contrast to crack cocaine. I mean, basically, I wanted to say that it was silly public policy to assume that all drugs are equivalent to crack cocaine. And this student asked me to advise him about whether or not he should experiment with the drug MDA. He had experimented with marijuana and LSD previously, and we had an hour-long conversation in which he explained to me his concerns. Basically, I told him that his particular concerns were not reasonable, were unfounded. And I told him that if he's going to experiment with drugs, this is an excellent drug to experiment with.
Okay. Doug, the complaint has been made that Stanford really reacted in this way because it put them in a bad position with the federal government. I mean, Bob Martinez was so mad that Stewart wrote him this letter that he contacted Donald Kennedy, the president of Stanford, and said, why are you letting this guy run around and say these things? Do you want to risk losing your federal funds? Now, is there any validity to that, that was really what was behind all this?
I'm not privy to the individual circumstances that went on in this case. The point, however, is that when an employer is made aware that the law is being violated on his premises, the policy and the law requires him to take action. It's not because somebody said they violated the law or talked or spoke or took a position. It's when it comes to their attention that a law has been violated that we must take an action.
So Stanford felt that it had to do that in this case.
That's the law.
I read, Stewart, your grievance that you filed about this, and you make the point that another thing that they're upset about is the fact that at a dinner with some students, there were some underage kids in the group and
Who ordered
alcoholic drinks, and that you paid for those. You make the point that if that's one of the reasons that you're being fired, that there's a whole lot of underage drinking going on at Stanford that everyone knows about.
That's right.
You refer to some kind of a study that was done about that. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, there were university staff members who did a study of students and found that 83% of Stanford undergraduates say that they drink regularly. Mm-hmm. And it's obviously not the case that 83% of them are of legal age. I mean, it's well known that there's a lot of underage drinking at Stanford, that there's alcohol served in freshman dorms, that alcohol is served in four-class dorms without checking of IDs. There's a lot of underage drinking going on, and Stanford is not doing anything about it at Stanford.
I think that's something that you could respond to, Doug. Is it does seem that Stewart's case is being, people are paying a lot more attention to it than they are to something like that. If it's true that 83% of Stanford undergraduates drink, isn't something being done about that?
I don't know how we handle the students, but the point to make is that it's the job of the employer, Stanford University, to, when the employer learns that the law has been violated, to take an action. It's not incumbent upon us to search out violations of the law. It's when we see violations of the law, or learn of them, or are told of them.
Okay. Stewart, you think that there are some important First Amendment problems with this drug and alcohol policy. Can you be real specific about what you think those are?
Okay, well, somewhat in response to what Doug was saying, the university became aware of my claims way back in November, and they did not act in November. And so I think that it's disingenuous of the university to claim that Bob Martinez's letter had nothing to do with their actions, because my claims to Martinez were identical to the claims that I made in the Stanford Daily. And so there's no new information that's come to light in that sense. Also, Doug mentioned progressive enforcement of the policy. That was the intent of the policy, that perhaps warning first, a letter of reprimand, some kind of suspension, eventually termination. But in my case, they've jumped to the maximum possible penalty, termination, even though I'm a first offender. As far as I can tell, I'm the first offender at Stanford, and they've chosen the maximum possible penalty. And the reason seems clear. If you read Martinez's letter, or if you listen to the arguments I've had with congressmen on national TV, What they are all most concerned about is my talking about drug use. That's why they think I should be fired. So I think it's clear that there's a hidden agenda here, that I'm being fired for what I'm saying, not for the backpack claim. Because if the backpack claim was the reason to fire me, I should have been fired in November.
Would you like to comment on any of that?
No, I really hear. I do know about the policy and what we do and are supposed to do. I'm not familiar with Stewart's case.
Well, I think one specific thing we should have you clarify, and that is it true that the policy says that there's supposed to be progressive, in other words, is it unusual to just go right to termination of someone? Are they supposed to be warned first?
The policy doesn't specify progressive discipline. It says it will take disciplinary action. In my trade, disciplinary action can be progressive, but the progression at which you move is a function of the egregiousness of the crime. Somebody who's tardy, you very slowly give oral warnings and written warnings because again, hope that they'll correct. But if somebody gets into a fist fight and hurts a co-employee or something, and that's much more egregious, you may not go through all the steps. You may fire them as soon as you found out the facts. Progressive discipline is there's not a standard application of it to all cases. It depends upon each case, case by case.
Okay. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the issues involved in the government's war on drugs and whether there are First Amendment principles that are being violated. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Weekday. I'm Suzanne Guyette. We're speaking with Stuart Regis, who is a Stanford professor who was fired for refusing to obey the university's drug and alcohol policy, and Doug Dupin, who is one of the Stanford administrators who helped to write that policy. Now, I said before the break, Stuart, that we were going to talk about the war on drugs, the government's war on drugs, and whether there are some First Amendment principles that have been violated in the process. First of all, though, I think one of the main reasons that you're in such hot water for this is because you're really going against public policy at this point. It's supposed to be public policy that drugs are always bad and that there can't be anything good about them. And what is it that you're saying about drugs?
Well, I think that some of this gets back to the government's view of drug education. I think you're absolutely right that the official line is that drugs are evil and that's the entire story. And my own experience suggests that that's not true. I believe that marijuana, for example, is a very different drug than crack cocaine, and it is not tearing apart this country the way crack cocaine is tearing apart this country. I believe that one of the scariest things that's happening here is that the government talks a lot about the need to have a consistent message. The consistent message is this drugs are evil. And I threaten that because I tell a different story than what the government tells. And that's, I think, really why I've been fired here. And I think that's a very frightening thing. If at a university where all opinions are supposed to be expressible and explorable, if even at a university these things that are counter to public opinion cannot be expressed, then there's no hope for freedom in this country.
Doug, can you comment on just the idea of whether a university should be involved in that kind of thing? Do you think that this drug and alcohol policy has anything to do with freedom of expression?
This drug and alcohol policy says nothing and intends to say nothing about speaking or talking. People, and you can read the Daily, not only Stewart's articles, but articles pro and con the president of the university, pro and con everything, speeches all over the place, rallies. People can say and do anything they want to. There is nothing whatsoever in the university policy, the drug and alcohol abuse policy, which says that you can't object to it, talk about it, ridicule it. You can say anything you want. There's nothing about freedom of speech or First Amendment rights in this policy.
Okay.
I think Doug's actually right about that it's not officially in the policy, but as at least one example, Donald Kennedy, our university president, wrote a long article to the student newspaper where he said speech is not always free, and sometimes speech becomes conduct. And he seems to feel that my conversation with this student, where I gave him advice about whether or not to experiment with MDA, can constitute punishable conduct. Mm-hmm. So there are certainly some members of the administration who feel that there should be limits on discussion. But Doug is right that it's not officially in this policy.
Stuart, what fascinates me about your case is most people would have been, if they were outraged by this policy, they would have been outraged about it. And as I said, they might have discussed it privately with a few people, but they wouldn't have risked their job this way. Was it important enough to you to risk your job? Obviously it was, because you did.
Well, I think it's really frightening what's happening to win the war on drugs. I think that the Bill of Rights is being thrown out in order to win the war on drugs. And I think that's a very frightening prospect. And yes, it was important enough to me to make this point. But I actually didn't expect to be fired. I mean, I expected that I would mostly be ignored. But I decided all along that if I could be fired for this, that it was worth being fired for this.
Doug, let's talk a little bit about, do you think it puts the university in an awkward position to have to police or enforce things like a drug and alcohol policy?
Yes, it is extremely awkward. Supervising and managing people is a difficult job, and it's hard enough to supervise and manage them in the work that they're being asked and paid to do. This adds a burden to management to have to enforce the law, but it is the law.
Stuart, this is not the first time that you have challenged a law. You also directly challenged the anti-sodomy law in Virginia. Tell us about that.
Well, I was concerned because I was banned from returning to my high school in Northern Virginia because the Washington Post had run an article in which they mentioned the fact that I'm an openly gay person. I had previously been welcomed. They asked me to talk to computer science students, videotaped my talks. I was kind of the returning hero. And after this article was published, I was told I could not come to the school anymore. I tried to submit an article to their student newspaper, and they refused to publish it. The principal refused to publish it. One of their excuses that they gave was that I am a criminal, and I would be encouraging students to break the law. So it seemed to me that one of the few things I could do to try to address this issue was to test the law. So I turned myself in at a couple of Virginia police stations, told them I had committed the felony, of having oral sex the Saturday night before, but they refused to arrest me. I mean, it's clear that this law in Virginia is being used as a way of limiting people's behavior, but they don't want to enforce it.
Okay. So this, in a way, was another example in your eyes of hypocrisy, of something that you needed to challenge.
Absolutely.
Okay. Doug, what do you think is, and I want to ask you both this question, what do you think is the appropriate government response to something like our drug and alcohol problem in this country? Do you think that this kind of enforcement is the way that is going to work? It's just a personal opinion, not a university opinion.
If I were smart enough to know that answer, I'd probably be president of the United States. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Do you have anything to say about that? I mean, obviously we do have a drug and alcohol problem in this country, and the government thinks that it has to have some response to that. If you don't think that what they're doing is right, you think that it's dangerous as far as First Amendment principles, what should the government be doing?
It's a social problem. It's not a criminal problem. And I think that the mistake the government is making is to have the enforcement approach to it. I mean, I think it's an amazing mistake to throw out the principles of the Bill of Rights in order to win the war on drugs. But I think it's even misguided to take the enforcement approach in the first place. If you want to really address drug problems in this country, I think you should have drug treatment on demand, poverty programs, better education, more realistic education. Those are things that we could do to address the drug problem in this country. It's a social problem. It's not a law enforcement problem.
Okay. Doug, I hate to keep asking you all these hard questions, but there's one other thing I have to ask you because people are aware of this, and that is that Stanford has had some serious trouble lately about federal funds for research, and they're in hot water about that. Now, again, I have to ask you the question, are they doing what the government says about Stewart because they are already in trouble with the government about these research funds?
Well, we adopted these policies long before we got into that trouble. So we did it before, but we did it because it is a federal regulation. Stanford University, by and large, believes in obeying the law. And when the government issues a regulation which applies to the university, it follows the regulation and obeys the law.
I want you to comment on that, Stuart. I mean, they are in a big mess here. I mean, what are they supposed to do? It is against the law, to take drugs and to sell drugs, and you didn't sell drugs, but what are they supposed to do about you here? What would you do if you were they?
A lot of people have suggested that an appropriate response for the university would be to say to the government that, yes, we will comply with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, and we will be committed to a drug-free workplace. But in proceeding against employees who have been accused of violating the policy, we will use the same standards of proof that are used in a court of law, that will be the way that we will approach it. And there are a lot of lawyers who have told me that they believe that would allow us to be in full compliance with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. In my case, they've used a standard of proof which is much lower than what would be admissible in a court of law. I think it's obvious from the fact that Bob Martinez said that he was turning my case over to the Justice Department. The legal system can't even get a search warrant issued about me, yet Stanford has fired me basically based on my talking, and that doesn't hold up in a court of law.
I want to talk a little bit about the UCLA instructor who was so incensed by this whole thing that he wrote a letter, a phony letter to Bob Martinez. Tell us about that.
Well, I think it just shows how far these people in Washington are willing to go, or how hysterical the mood is there. I mean, it was obviously a satirical letter that this UCLA professor wrote, and the fact that they took it so seriously.
What did he say in the letter? Tell us that.
He said that he had marijuana in the drawer of his filing cabinet, that he had given a lecture the week before, stoned. It was obviously a tongue-in-cheek letter, and the university insisted on searching his office. I think it was not the police who searched his office, it was the university. I think it's really frightening. It shows the level of hysteria on this issue.
You told me that you had lunch with 250 kids with backpacks at Stanford, so you're getting some support from people.
Yeah.
Okay, glad to hear that. Well, again, it's been good to have you both on. I think this is an important issue. We're glad that you could be with us. I'm sorry if we gave you a hard time,
That's
but
all right.
it's hard to
My
be
job.
the university's representative. Stuart, we wish you well in your grievance, and we hope that this works out justly. I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks very much for joining us, and we hope you'll be with us tomorrow for another weekday.